Now it's time for Toker Talk Radio, the voice of the marijuana nation.
What are you people? On dope?
Where you can toke.
I inhale frequently.
Or you can talk.
I experimented with marijuana and didn't inhale.
Or you can toke and talk.
10 federal criminal penalties for possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana.
While we talk about toke on Toker Talk Radio.
So, by the way, when it comes to pot, if you're 40 years old, you live in a log cabin in Oregon, you got 12 giant pot plants in your backyard, have a ball.
Live from beautiful Portland, Oregon at Rolla J Studios.
Hey, this is great. Just like cannabis.
Plus your calls live at 971-533-7111.
They're walking on their pants with their cap on backwards, listening to Enema Man and Snoopy Poop Dog.
What's to keep somebody from getting all potted up on weed and then getting behind the wheel? Gateway theory doesn't work. It's a reality.
Holland, is it real? Don't tease me.
We're locking up people that take a couple of puffs of marijuana, and the next thing you know, they got 10 years.
And now, here's your host, the guru of ganja graphics, the sultan of sativa statistics, and the worst nightmare of a reefer mad prohibitionist. A polite, perspicacious, productive pothead with a propensity for PowerPoint. Radical Russ Belville.
Oh, thank you so much. Welcome, it's Toker Talk Radio. Coming to you live from Lakewood, Colorado, Arrowhead Studios. Brian the Red is back at Rollatide Studios in Portland, Oregon. We're kind of doing a remote show to a temporary studio. Amazing, man.
Indeed. We are all over the place, man. We are representing the marijuana nation, and that is what it's about.
Yeah, man. And in case you got here late and you're waiting for the flashback tonight, Brian the Red's taking the night off tonight. Deservedly so. I'm telling you, man, you worked your ass off. You did a great job up there in Aspen.
Man, it was a pleasure being up there. And thanks again to Randy for helping me get up there. That was one of the most badass experiences that I have had in my entire life. So, and I got a lot of great pictures that are up there for our VIP members, and we got some good footage of all of these seminars, the full footage for our VIPs. So check out those links.
Yeah, I'm taking the best four, at least the four that impressed me the most, and playing them on these Toker Talk radios. But they're cutting off at the end. You might be losing the last 5 or 10 minutes because they don't fit in the full hour. And you can get the full versions are going to be in the 420 radio news feed, but they're only going to be available for bronze, silver, gold, or platinum VIPs. So you actually have to be a paying member to get that full video, because we got to pay the bills somehow. But you'll at least get some samples here in Toker Talk Radio, and we hope you enjoy those. I got to say, going up to Aspen, it was just, I was excited for you going up there, Brian, but, I was even more excited to meet people from, Connecticut and from Chicago,
Maryland,
and they're
Chicago,
like, "Oh my God, the
Michigan.
freedom! I mean, we'd be fried if we were doing this."
Yeah, people from Michigan and Chicago and all over the place, and then some people from the down in Florida even, and it was just kind of great to see everybody come together. And I say it was one of the least stressful cannabis encounters I have ever been through. You never, no looking over your shoulder, no wondering if somebody's gonna see your lighter spark up. Yeah, they might come over and offer to pack your bowl. Yeah, so it was great.
So it's a good way to have it, man. That's for sure. So we will play a replay tonight of the flashback. It'll be on at 8:00. Coming up next, you'll get a replay of last night's A Different View, where they're doing the remote studios as well. So check that out coming up next. And tomorrow, I think I might be on a remote. I got an answer back in email. They said, "Well, what do you need for a remote?" And I said, internet access and electricity. That's all I need. So might be coming to you from a dispensary or a grow. I'm not sure which tomorrow. And I was trying to get Kimberly Ryan. She's the attorney who is appealing that case here about the Colorado lawful off-duty statute, lawful off-duty activity statute. They have a law in Colorado here that says, if you're not breaking the law, then your boss can't use it against you to fire you. if you're joining the Masons or whatever, you're building a tree house, whatever you might be doing, as long as it's legal, your boss can't use it against you. Well, here in Colorado, you got a constitutional right to have marijuana and to smoke it. So this guy got fired for his P test, and he said, well, wait a minute, it's a lawful off-duty activity. And the Colorado courts came back and they said, well, it's against federal law. And so this attorney, Kimberly Ryan, I met her up in Aspen, is part of the law team that is suing, it may be just her, that is suing to appeal this, to say, now, wait a minute, what the hell does federal law have to do with a Colorado state statute about state laws being, you can't discriminate against? I mean, what good does it do, right? So we will follow up on that. I was hoping to get her on, but she's, of course, very busy trying to file the case, so we'll see if we can get her on later. But on tomorrow's show, we will have Sean McAllister from DFW NORML, the executive director. He's going to talk about that upcoming Texas NORML conference that's going on, the Texas Regional NORML Conference in Fort Worth, Texas. I'll be there doing 2 presentations and emceeing 3 different events. They get their money's worth when they fly me out there. And from there, I'll be joining up with the FNAs and going on tour. At the regional conference, Keith Stropp will be there. Eric Altieri, also from NORML. Rob Campia from the Marijuana Policy Project will be there. Judge Jim Gray is a keynote speaker. The Libertarian vice presidential candidate will be there, Judge Jim Gray. So going to be an amazing conference. Now, coming up next, what we got here is Paul Armentano from Aspen, from our Aspen Legal Seminar this previous weekend. And his latest presentation on THC and impairment. He goes over all the latest studies, all the latest information, and he will give you that, more detail than you can imagine is coming up next. We'll give you most of this video. If you want to get the full video link is available to VIPs. You'll find it at 420 Radio in the 420 Radio News area. So we'll take a quick break, and when we come back from break, we will take you to that Paul Armentano video. Thanks for watching Toker Talk Radio. Be right back.
You cut people, you smoke trees till you get what you need now. Designer drugs and minted smokes to get through the day. You always get them so high.
We'll be right back after these messages from our 420 friendly sponsors. Support these advertisers because their ad money goes straight to the Russ Belville Show. You're tuned into the Russ Belville Show, the voice of the marijuana nation.
We're going back to San Francisco. That's right, everyone. The High Times Medical Cannabis Cup is returning to the Bay on June 22nd and 23rd. Come to the Craneway Pavilion in Richmond, California for a High Times celebration of the best weed in the world. Meet the top canna businesses of the Golden State. Hear experts discuss indoor and outdoor growing. Find out about cannabis cuisine. Learn about the exciting new world of concentrates. Enjoy a massive medication area reserved for California medical marijuana patients only. And don't forget our swinging Saturday night concert when the stars come out. But as everybody knows, it's all about the cannabis. On Sunday night, we present the High Times Medical Cannabis Cup Awards for Best Sativa, Best Indica, Best Hybrid, Best Concentrate, Best Edibles, and more. Plus, we honor a living legend of the modern cannabis movement, San Francisco's own Dennis Perrone. That's June 22nd and 23rd at the Craneway Pavilion in Richmond, California. Go to medcancup.com for details. Be part of the growing cannabis community.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you hear me in the back? If you can't hear me in the back, raise your hand. Seriously, can you hear me now? Welcome to day 2 of the NORML conference. My name is Jeff Wirtz. I'm a local litigator here in Aspen. Been a member of the NORML Legal Committee maybe 8 years or so. I think this is the 3rd or 4th time I've moderated here in Aspen. And so I thank Keith for asking me to do it again this year. He said you don't need to be too interesting or too funny or too informative or too entertaining. You just be yourself. I think that'll work out. Just some housekeeping matters. The party tonight at the Goldstein's house, if you haven't signed up for that and paid the very reasonable fee to do so, it's not to be missed. for you first-timers especially, not to be missed. There is a shuttle, several shuttles that'll go from here at the Gant down to Chris and Jerry's house. Don't try to find it using Google Maps or walking, because you'll get lost. And take the shuttle or find someone who knows where they're going, catch a ride. It's just too difficult, especially when it gets dark, to find your way into that hovel and out of there. Because it is, once you get there, you'll see what I mean. But, is anyone who thinks they're not going to the party and is on the fence? Who's not going to the party tonight? I know you're underage, but I think you ought to come. We'll raise some money for it, don't worry. All right. There are some people here today that weren't here yesterday, didn't get a chance to introduce themselves. Let's see a show of hands of who is here now that was not here yesterday morning. Okay, that's not too many. I see Lauren Davis, who's our moderator tomorrow, but there's a gentleman in the row in front of her. Why don't we start with from the front, go to the back, just stand, give us a 10-second short version of your life. You are first. Yep.
Hi, I'm James Selthoffner. I'm from Wisconsin/Michigan, activist, entrepreneur. Right now I'm focusing on relocating people from Wisconsin, which is a non-medical state, to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which is a medical state. So that's my latest adventure.
I'm North Arbellas from Denver, Colorado. Welcome to the country and the world's first completely regulated adult market over the age of 21. So, as an ambassador of that, welcome to our state. Yeah.
I'm Curtis Dana. I'm the executive director of Minnesota NORML. I'm a Rastafarian and very interested in how the law intersects with religion. I'm not a lawyer, but just here to enjoy the time. And I'm also very interested in the scheduling of cannabis, both at the state level and at the federal level. Thanks a lot.
Denver, Colorado. I'm an activist, lawyer, specialized in marijuana-related criminal defense as well as business and regulatory licensing.
April Aristati. I'm an attorney from Connecticut. I'm relatively new to the movement and the industry, but I can say this is the best legal seminar I've ever seen.
Is that all the new folks? Okay.
Scott Harper. I'm from South Central Pennsylvania, and I do about half criminal work, half family law. A lot of family law deals with new law in Pennsylvania, where if you got busted for pot, it can be disfavored or temporary. So I do a lot.
Unless you're on. All right, we do have an honored guest among us here. It's Nelson Harvey. He's a reporter with the Aspen Daily News. I call him an honored guest so I can point out his presence. So if you don't want it written, don't let it happen. That's the motto of the Aspen Daily News. And if you're asked to give a hypothetical about your upcoming case, you might want to say it's John Doe instead of the client's real name. And we are streaming live on 420radio.org, as you all know, so watch your language. I think the chances of my mother listening are very slim to none. Our speaker this morning, the first speaker is Paul Armentano. As all of you know, he is the Deputy Director of NORML. We're very lucky to have him. I introduced him last year. He is just simply an expert among experts on the topic of THC, DUID, testing, science. I mean, this morning he's going to talk about stoned people. He's going to talk about drunk people. He's going to talk about drunk people that are stoned. No, we're not here to talk about my in-laws. He's going to talk about science and the law. The topic is, the science is on your side. What you need to know about cannabis and psychomotor performance. Now, many of you know Paul co-authored a book. It's called Marijuana is Safer, so why are we driving people to drink? Paul has a habit of making a statement and then a question. So I'm going to give a talk later called Paul Armentano. Why does he always make a statement followed by a question? Paul Armentano.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you all for being here. Can you hear me okay? All right. Yeah, for the next hour or so, we are going to talk about the science as it pertains to the topic of cannabis and driving, which is a topic I've actually grown to laud. I did not get into this movement to be the go-to guy to talk about the science, whether it's talking about it with legal attorneys like you or with the mainstream media. But for better or worse, I've become that guy. And I've realized as we move from the theory of marijuana legalization to the practice of marijuana legalization and regulation, that this is a very important discussion that we need to have. We've been having it on a theoretical level on one level. In some places, like in Colorado, we're now having it at the practical level. And I want to bestow a lot of that common sense information on you so you can talk about this law, talk about this issue, and frame this issue in a way that is most in line with the science and arguably most benefits the consumers that use cannabis. So, first slide here notes that acute cannabis intoxication may be associated with changes in psychomotor performance. Notice that I didn't say impairment. Some changes in psychomotor performance may be equated with impairment, but other changes aren't necessarily equated with impairment. So I think it's important that we draw that distinction right away. What we do see consistently is that individuals may perform one way at baseline, and then after dosing with cannabis, they may perform slightly differently. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're impaired. Now, these changes in performance are typically dose-related. That simply means that the larger the dose or the greater potency of the cannabis, the greater the change in performance. These changes in performance are most acute in naive users, which means more experienced users, you'll see less dramatic changes. And these changes in performance are typically very short-lived. And depending on which government resource you want to look at, particularly NHTSA, there tends to be a consensus that somewhere between 10 minutes to 20 minutes after a subject inhales cannabis, that person is going to be great. That is the point in time where they will most greatly be under the influence of cannabis. And that period of time will last from about 10 minutes to 20 minutes to about 40 minutes to 60 minutes. What we see during that time is that on performance tasks, subjects are most likely to make the most mistakes in that 20 to 40 minute window after using cannabis. And then about 60 minutes after using cannabis, they tend to make far fewer mistakes, and then within a couple hours, their performance is similar to how it was at baseline. And we see this sort of short, narrow window of changes in performance. We see that this is a fairly consistent timeline. NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, says this right on their website, where they say peak acute effects following cannabis inhalation are typically obtained within 10 to 30 minutes. And then NHTSA admits in their 2003 report, which is a very good report, I would encourage everybody to get a hold of one, it's online, they say experimental research on the effects of cannabis indicate that these effects dissipate quickly after 1 hour. That's NHTSA's position on the length of time one is going to have changes in performance after using cannabis. Now, these changes in performance tend to be relatively subtle, particularly if we are comparing these changes with those we already accept to be associated with alcohol. And again, we have consistent literature showing that these changes in performance are rather nominal. Robey and colleagues in 1993 were commissioned by the U.S. Department of Transportation and by NHTSA to do a comprehensive study where subjects were drove on a closed course, they drove in traffic, and then they drove in high urban density traffic. They drove in all three scenarios sober, they drove in all three scenarios after dosing, and when researchers, investigators looked at the results of their performance in all three driving exams, they said THC's adverse effects on driving performance appear to be relatively small. Andrew Sewell and colleagues from Yale. Andrew Sewell has written a tremendous paper on this issue called The Effect of Cannabis Compared with Alcohol and Driving. Full text is available on PubMed. Again, I would encourage you to get it and read it. Andrew Sewell said that most marijuana-intoxicated drivers show only modest impairments on actual road tests. This is an important study from 2001. This was done in the Netherlands. This is the last study that I'm aware of in the peer-reviewed literature where investigators actually took subjects, dosed them with marijuana, put them behind the wheel of a car, and let them out in public traffic. This was not done on a closed course. They had driving instructors in the passenger seat next to them. The driving instructors had a button they could push to stop the car instantly if they thought the driver that was driving in actual traffic after having smoked marijuana was so impaired that they're about to cause an accident. And this study was published in 2001, and the researchers concluded that the effects of low doses of THC and higher level driving skills as measured in the present study are minimal. Again, this is a very important study because the federal government took the time to talk about this study in their own report. And they summarized it on page 42 when they said that the task was to drive through city streets while responding to traffic controls, crossing intersections, and making turns at intersections. Using driving instructors' performance scores, Lemur and Remakers, those are the authors, found, quote, essentially no differences between the dosed and non-dosed conditions. Again, that's the U.S. federal government speaking on the literature, or summarizing and highlighting the literature that's already there. So, why do we see, in many cases, this subtle or nominal change in performance? And there's a number of reasons for that. One of the reasons is, as I mentioned earlier, we tend to see that experienced users become tolerant to the effects of cannabis. And that doesn't mean there's simply more experience at driving under the influence of marijuana. What we're talking about is that the effects of marijuana that would otherwise alter psychomotor performance, they have become tolerant, these subjects have become tolerant to those effects. And we see this consistently in the literature, in about a half dozen studies now, where experienced users are compared to naive users on a number of different performance task tests, including critical tracking and divided attention task tests, which are the sort of laboratory tests that are typically used to measure changes in psychomotor performance. So, and we have very recent studies by Hart, Andrew Sewell, Johannes Ramakers, and a number of others, showing that frequent marijuana users may show fewer behavioral signs of disruption during intoxication than infrequent users, even when difficult memory tasks are used to assess cognitive performance. So it's not a matter, when one's trying to assess whether one is impaired by cannabis, it's not a matter to just look at how much cannabis they've used or how recently they've used cannabis. You also have to factor in the individual's prior history of cannabis use to try and be able to infer how the cannabis use may be affecting one's performance. Now, one area where the literature is consistent in showing us that the effects of cannabis use aren't particularly subtle or aren't particularly nominal are in cases when cannabis is used in concert with alcohol. And we see consistently in the literature that in these scenarios, there seems to be a synergistic effect between the two drugs and a synergistic adverse effect on psychomotor performance. In other words, these subjects tend to drive worse under the combined use of alcohol and cannabis than they do if they're driving under the influence of one substance alone or the other substance alone. And again, we see this quite often through the literature, the talk of that there is in fact an additive effect when these two substances are used together. And we see this additive effect even when we're talking about subjects that would otherwise be very tolerant to marijuana. They seem to lose that tolerance when alcohol is thrown into the mix. So what are some of these manifestations or changes in performance that we see associated with cannabis use when alcohol is not in the picture? And these tend to be some of the 3 or 4 or 5 changes in performance that we see consistently in the literature. We see some increase in brake latency. We see that subjects tend to weave more than they did at baseline. SDLP simply means standard deviation, lateral positioning. We see some decreased performance in critical tracking, some increased reaction time, some changes in peripheral vision. Subjects tend to look straight ahead but pay less attention to what's going on their sides. A little more change in time of decision making. But what's really important about this is that these adverse changes in performance are far more pronounced on simulator studies than they are in on-road studies. Yes, Lee?
What's brake latency?
How long it takes them to hit the brake. So if there's a stop sign ahead, when were they going to start to hit the brake, to stop correctly for the stop sign?
That's the same as reaction.
So this is interesting because obviously the majority of studies that we have assessing this issue are studies on simulators. And on simulators, we tend to see that subjects do not perform as well under the influence of marijuana than they do in these limited studies like Robey did, like Lamar's did, where they actually took individuals, gave them marijuana, and put them on the road. And there's probably a number of different psychological reasons why that's the case. We do know that subjects generally tend to drive more cautiously. They tend to be hyper-aware. They subjectively think that they're more impaired than they actually are. And because of that, they try to compensate accordingly. I would argue that when they're physically on the road, that subjects are taking greater lengths to try and compensate for their perceived impairment than they are perhaps when they're simply in these simulator studies. And that's why we see this slight difference. Because the reality is when we look at the actual on-road tests, or we look at the elevated risk of accident from individuals who have marijuana in their system, we simply don't see the sort of elevated odd ratios that we would expect given some of the changes that we see on these simulator studies. And one of the papers that was just published that I included in your materials is a meta-analysis from Accident Analysis and Prevention by Elvik. This is ahead of print, so it's not available yet, but I was able to get a copy, and I shared it with you, which I'm not supposed to do, but I think you would value from this paper. And essentially it's a meta-analysis, and so this author went through about 67 different published papers looking at that assessed the accident risk of subjects who drove under the influence of a variety of different drugs. And they set up odd ratios. And as you probably know, you don't have an elevated risk until you have an odd ratio that is much above 1. Anytime you get very close to 1, then you have no risk. And if you're under 1, you have limited risk. When they looked at the subject of cannabis, and they looked at cannabis's role in injury, it tested at 1.08. So there's basically no statistically significant risk. This was a meta-analysis. This was after they combined looking at all of the data, not just a single study. They're looking at over 60 studies. 1.08 was the risk of injury that they assessed for cannabis. To put that in perspective, antihistamines had a risk of injury of 1.12, and penicillin had a risk of injury of 1.12. Lawmakers are not asking for per se standards or zero-tolerant per se standards for antihistamines and penicillin, last I knew. There are other drugs as well. Amphetamines at a 4.5 times risk. So they had a statistically significant risk, far greater than we saw for cannabis. The benzodiazepines had double the risk that we saw for cannabis, and so on and so forth. So what we see is the on-road actual accident risk tends to be relatively low.
Paul?
Yeah.
Was that not the study that was cited as saying you're twice as more likely to be in an accident?
That was from BMJ. And BMJ looked at a handful of studies. I think they looked at 6. And there's a caveat to that. You're twice as likely to have an accident. Individuals are twice as likely within the first hour after inhalation of having an accident. That is what they concluded based on their meta-analysis of a much smaller cohort of studies.
Is there any ratio relating to fatigue that's been studied?
That's a good question. I asked that question to a researcher who specialized in this issue many years ago, and at that time his answer was no. I don't know if there's been any change since then, but I did pose the question once to an individual who was engaged in a lot of these simulator studies, and he said, we know it's a factor, we don't know to what degree. So why is there a reason we're seeing some changes on some of these studies, but we don't tend to be seeing these changes being pronounced or having real-world consequences on the road? And I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Some of the reasons have to do with the fact that cannabis simply does not manifest itself like alcohol. We see that there's less aggressive driving associated with marijuana. Allison Smiling, colleagues talked about this in 1999, and they said in contrast to the compensatory behavior exhibited by subjects under marijuana treatment, subjects who receive alcohol tend to drive in a more risky manner. Individuals under the influence of alcohol tend to maintain a much slower speed than they do at baseline. They increase the distance between their vehicle and the vehicle in front of them, so they don't tailgate. They actually leave more space in case something unforeseen has to happen. They tend to overestimate time, how long things are going to take. We know that under the influence of alcohol, subjects tend to underestimate time. This is really the key, though. The subjects seem to be aware of their impairment. Sometimes they're hyper-aware of their impairment. They think they're more impaired than they actually are, and they try to compensate for that accordingly. Robey and colleagues talked about this when they did their driving studies in '93, and a number of other researchers have highlighted this as well. They say subjects in the marijuana group are not only aware of their intoxicated condition, but were attempting to compensate for it. These findings support the common belief that drivers become overconfident after drinking alcohol, and that they become more cautious and self-critical after consuming THC, as in smoked marijuana. And then we see this. In some cases, they refuse to drive altogether. This was a study done where researchers gave oral THC to a number of subjects and then asked them to go out and drive on a closed course. And the subjects simply refused to do so. They said, I don't feel like I'm in any condition or I can drive safely. So they refused to participate in the study. I very seriously doubt you would see those sort of results with alcohol. So,
but I am willing to try.
So with that sort of background, then we get to this larger sort of public policy question that ends up ending with this issue of, if we're going to legalize and regulate marijuana, then how are we going to regulate the idea, or how are we going to try and dissuade individuals from driving under the influence of marijuana? And right now, under the law, we have a number of tools that are in place to try and assist in the identification and targeting, in some cases prosecution and conviction, of individuals alleged to be driving under the influence of marijuana. We have field sobriety tests, we have DREs, we have urine toxicology results, and we have blood test results. Unfortunately, I would argue that none of these tools are particularly sufficient for appropriately or properly identifying people who may in fact be under the influence of marijuana. And there's a number of basic reasons why. The field sobriety tests aren't consistently sensitive to cannabis intoxication. The DREs, the drug recognition experts, typically receive little cannabis-specific training. The urine test results are just simply a joke. The presence of inert cannabis metabolites alone are not associated with impaired driving. And the blood test is what I'm going to finish with, because this is what's sort of the hot topic these days. But I would argue that psychomotor impairment may not be reliably inferred from the presence of THC in a single blood test.
Paul, are you saying the DREs are bullshit even if they're properly done?
I'll get to that.
Okay, thank you.
I'd say that DREs could be better trained. So the field sobriety test. Field sobriety, the big issue with field sobriety tests are that field sobriety tests were designed and developed to identify people that were under the influence of alcohol. And in the few cases they've been validated scientifically, they've been validated to identify individuals under the influence of alcohol. Cannabis does not manifest itself like alcohol, as we talked about earlier. So then why then would we think that a test or performance task that were designed to identify whether someone was under the influence of alcohol would be particularly sensitive to identify somebody who was not under the influence of alcohol, and in fact may be under the influence of a drug that manifests itself very differently than does alcohol? We wouldn't particularly expect that test to be very sensitive. And not surprisingly, we see this routinely throughout the literature. Bosker and colleagues, writing in 2012, acknowledge that standard field sobriety tests have been validated for alcohol, but their sensitivity to impairment induced by other drugs is unknown. That's a cute way of saying we've actually tried to test these same performance tests for people under the influence of other drugs, and they don't do very well. So they say it's unknown. Traditional teaching has held that the horizontal gaze nystagmus test is a sign of intoxication by sedatives such as alcohol, but not marijuana. The acknowledgement that the HGN test isn't applicable if you're trying to identify somebody under the influence of marijuana, but of course the HGN test is a core part of any field sobriety test. It's part of the DRE exam as well. Why? If we're interested in a subject being under the influence of marijuana.
Does that Kibbe article talk about how the HGN was basically developed by California State Control for basically depressants, Quaalude use?
I'd have to go back and look at it. This is an interesting paper by Downey and colleagues, where they say subjects are far more likely to demonstrate altered performance on the HGN test, walk and turn test, and one leg stand when THC was consumed together with alcohol, compared to instances where subjects consumed THC alone. Well, no shit. The test is meant to identify people under the influence of alcohol. When you give them THC, they're not sensitive to these markers. When you give them THC and also give them alcohol, they are sensitive because the alcohol, they're under the influence of alcohol, and that's what the test was designed to look for. This is an interesting paper by Shinar. A couple years ago, I was up here and shared the stage with another colleague, and he went into this study. This is an important study. I would really encourage people to get it. I could talk for 20 minutes just about what they found in this paper that Shinar and colleagues did. But in this particular case, they took individuals who were trained DRE officers. They took a number of subjects, and a number of the subjects were administered different types of drugs, not just cannabis, but amphetamines, cocaine, and heroin. And the DRE officers had to use 10 distinct tasks that they had, performance tools that they had learned to determine if these people were under the influence of drugs. They did the HGN, they looked at cardiovascular, they looked at muscle rigidity. But they weren't allowed to ask the subjects if they'd used drugs. They couldn't communicate with them. They had to use their training to look for physiological signs that these people were under the influence of drugs. Now, this was double-blinded. So half the subjects got a drug, half the subjects didn't get a drug, and nobody knew other than the subjects. But the officers had no idea who got the drug and who didn't. Well, they didn't do very well. In the end, 30 subjects got marijuana, but the DRE-approved officers only identified 15 of them as being under the influence of marijuana. So half of the subjects that were dosed with marijuana, the DRE officers weren't able to identify. It gets worse than that, though, because the DRE officers falsely identified 57% of the subjects in the study. That means that 57% of subjects were stone cold sober. They'd gone to placebo, but the DREs, with all their expert training, determined that they were under the influence of drugs. So we have another study. This one's from Australia. They're also trying to use standard field sobriety tests and see if using the field sobriety test they can properly identify individuals who are under the influence of various drugs, including marijuana. You see that their success rate's a little better. It's somewhere between 65 and 75%. This study is actually interesting, though, because the researchers actually tweaked the standard field sobriety test. they included a number of different physiological indicators and task performance that wouldn't be included in the standard field sobriety test. And only by including those different markers were they able to up their success rate, which even at its best still said they got it wrong at least 25% of the time. This is another paper from 2012 by Bosker and colleagues. This is an important paper too. It's got a small sample size, but they found that overall, the overall field sobriety test score did not discriminate between THC and baseline. In other words, when they did the walk and turn, and HGN and one leg stand, and everything else, no matter how the subjects that were dosed with marijuana scored on it, they didn't score in such a way that was really any different than they scored before they'd done any drugs whatsoever. So in other words, the field sobriety test failed to identify anyone in the subject who was under the influence of marijuana. Again, we see this over and over again. Performance on the HGN and the walk and turn did not significantly contribute to the prediction of drug category. And then we say current field sobriety tests are insufficiently sensitive to detect, in this case, even oral THC-induced driving impairment. And I would argue that individuals under the influence of THC that they've taken orally, their manifestations of impairment or change in performance tend to be even more pronounced. But the standard field sobriety test was not sensitive enough to pick those changes up either. Addressing the DRE analysis, I'll make a couple quick comments on this. DRE officers obviously are not medically trained, but they talk like they are. They're assessing the HGN, they're looking for nystagmus. What are we supposed to believe? They're trained optometrists? Where do they get this expertise in being able to make judgments on somebody by simply looking at their eye? They're talking about muscle rigidity. Where do they go to get their medical training? They're talking about increased elevated pulse rates. Are they cardiovascular surgeons? Where did they get this training that allows them to engage in this sort of physiological evaluation and then draw these conclusions from it? I think it's important to raise that question. The DRE training itself, there's not a whole lot to it, depending on which training you want to go through. Usually we're talking about 2 weeks of training. In the case of the RIDE training, we're only talking 16 weeks. I was reading a story from Illinois just last week, and law enforcement officers were saying the sky was going to fall because Illinois was going to allow the medical use of marijuana. The cops were claiming that none of them were trained to identify somebody driving under the influence of marijuana. The cop who spoke in this article said there was a single cop in the entire state of Illinois who was trained he was a trained DRE. And he said in order to get this training, you had to go to Las Vegas, and you had to go there for many months, and then come back, and you were DRE. There may be other reasons their cops are going to Las Vegas for months, but it's not to get DRE training. And when you get this DRE training, it doesn't tell you a whole lot about marijuana. So here's the DRE training manual. It looks impressive. It's got a big binder. It's got so many pages, they don't even give it page numbers, I guess. But here's the subject. Here's the section on cannabis. I like this first page. Cannabis. The rest is blank. This page is really dangerous. They couldn't even fill up the whole page. They only use half the page. They simply stop. It says cannabis. And this tells you what the next few pages are going to tell you about. And then you get the overview of cannabis. That's a page. Possible effects of cannabis. That's only a third of a page. Onset and duration of cannabis effects. That's half a page. Signs and symptoms of cannabis overdose. That's interesting. You think that would be a very short section? Lowering of testosterone, if you didn't know.
That's an overdose?
That's an overdose symptom, yes. How is the cop administering the DRE exam going to discover if someone has low testosterone?
Turn your head, cop.
Then you have the expected results of the evaluation. And some of these are really, there's some funny stuff here. In that injection sites, they're talking about body tremors, eyelid tremors, all sorts of things that I'm sure none of you have ever found associated with. Yeah, with marijuana. Then we've got topics for study. That's half a page. And we have a couple case studies. And then we're on to the next section. We have 12 total pages in the DRE manual. And that's what they learn about cannabis. And that's how they become an expert in court, because they know all there is to know about cannabis and how things like eyelid tremors, which they constantly will check on their DRE evaluation, are associated with the recent use of cannabis, even though, as I say here, when you go to PubMed, and I do a lot, PubMed is the national federal government repository where you can look up every scientific study that's ever been published in the peer-reviewed literature. Ever. Any one of them. If it's published in a foreign language, they translate it into English for you. So please don't ever come up to me and say, oh, there was this study about marijuana and the government, they censored it, they shelved it, they bullshit. It's on PubMed. Just type in its title. And if you do that for marijuana, you'll see there's about 25,000 published papers about marijuana available in the peer-reviewed literature, about 25,000 of them. Type in marijuana slurred speech, type in marijuana body eyelid tremors, or type in marijuana green tongue. These are all indicators in the indicator list from the DRE manual. These are indicators of use of marijuana according to the DRE manual. How many hits, how many papers will come up when you type in marijuana slurred speech in PubMed? Zero. Not one. Type in body eyelid tremors, marijuana. Zero. Type in green tongue. Zero. There is not a single reference in the tens of thousands of peer-reviewed literature available saying that cannabis is associated with any of these general indicators that the DRE manual says are indicators of cannabis use and impairment. And you can go on down the list, and I would suggest you do that. And then this question, are DREs really experts? A colleague of mine on the NLC list, Manny Daskell, sent this around a few months ago. I hope he sent it to everybody. I know he sent it to me. It was a decision from Carroll County in Maryland. And the question was, were DREs really qualified as experts? And I don't want to read you the whole thing. This is the gist of it. But there's so much good stuff in this decision. But essentially, the court ruled that these guys have no idea what the fuck they're talking about. They said the court finds that a drug recognition expert is not sufficiently qualified to render an opinion, that the testimony is not relevant, and that the probative value of the evidence is substantially outweighed by its prejudicial effect. And it literally goes on and on and on like that. Yes?
And Minnesota has a similar court decision where they said you couldn't even call them a drug recognition expert in front of a jury. You have to call them a drug recognition officer. Mm-hmm. And the court goes through a pretty good breakdown of why they're not an expert. And it would be good for people in other jurisdictions if they are challenging the expert to use that, because the court breaks it down.
Great, excellent.
And I think that's like a 2004 case like that.
Okay, and I'd say this too, any of the papers I talk about, that court case in particular, if you write me offline, I have these things all saved as PDF. I'd be happy to forward them around. Okay, yeah?
I actually have a quick FST question. I've been told by a forensic expert that convergence, lack of convergence, is an indicator of marijuana or cannabis impairment or THC impairment. And slow, delayed internal clock. Mm-hmm. Do you agree, and can you actually?
I think the literature is consistent on the delayed internal clock, for sure.
And convergence?
I'll tell you what the DRE manual says. They cheat on that. They say there may be a lack of convergence or there may not. So either way, it's evidence. That's the way they play that. So that would lead me to believe that it's inconsistent. Yes. Okay, so now getting into the pharmacokinetics with my last 10-15 minutes. And this is the area where in a second we're going to get into blood testing, which really seems to be the hot topic of the moment. These are just some terms in a chart that you really need to be familiarized with. Pharmacokinetics sounds like a real big deal word. It simply means what happens to an active drug after it's been ingested. It refers to the body absorbing the drug, metabolizing the drug, and then getting rid of the drug. And you see this blue line that spikes immediately and then drops very quickly and then sort of slowly fades away a few hours later. that is the level of active THC in the blood after a person has inhaled a marijuana cigarette. So you see that the peak THC blood levels occur almost instantly before the person's arguably even finished smoking. Now, but then they begin to dissipate very, very quickly. Now, this green line that's sort of dotted, it refers to carboxy-THC. Carboxy-THC is not psychoactive. It means it's not associated with any physiological changes or mood-altering changes. Now, obviously, because carboxy-THC is a breakdown product of THC, it can't begin to form until the THC begins to be broken down. So as the THC is getting broken down, you're getting less THC, you're getting more carboxy-THC, because the THC is being converted into the carboxy-THC. And then there's this red line. That's 11-hydroxy-THC. That's also a breakdown product of THC. But unlike carboxy-THC, 11-hydroxy-THC is psychoactive. Some people would even argue it's more psychoactive than THC. This tends to only hang around at very low levels, and it doesn't hang around very long, just for a few hours. But I do think it can be argued that if you had a blood test result and THC was present and hydroxy-THC was present, that's a fairly good indicator that that recent use may have occurred. But generally what you see is THC was present at a very low level, no hydroxy-THC was present, or you get simply carboxy-THC present. And it's very difficult to infer from just the presence of one or two of those markers really anything about recency of use or impairment. One thing, though, that you can clearly see from this chart is that it is entirely different than the chart you would see for blood alcohol levels. Because with blood alcohol, you would see the line of blood in the alcohol going up in accordance to the more one drinks. So as a person has one drink, it's here. As they have two drinks, it's here. As they have three drinks, it's here. And we know that the more one drinks, the higher the VAC. The higher the VAC, the greatest impairment. When a person has drank their highest quantity is when they have the highest level of blood alcohol and they're most impaired. We have just the opposite scenario here. This is called counterclockwise hysteresis. This means that we have peak levels of the active drug in the blood, but the peak impairment in the subject from this drug lags well behind the level of peak impairment. We don't have that with alcohol. A person is most impaired when their blood alcohol content is highest. Here, a person is not impaired when their THC levels are at their highest. And in fact, they are most likely to be under the influence of cannabis as their THC blood levels are dropping rapidly. I talked about that 20-minute to 60-minute window on those first couple slides. Well, during that window, their THC levels aren't rising, they're actually falling. We have this inverse correlation that we have compared to alcohol. Now, I mentioned carboxy-THC. Carboxy-THC is a byproduct of THC. THC is what is altering performance. We only have significant levels of carboxy-THC after THC has been converted into carboxy-THC. So why would we ever presume that the presence of carboxy-THC, I don't care what level you have it in, is evidence of impairment? To me, it should be argued that this is evidence of lack of impairment, because we know for a fact that the impairing substance in cannabis is no longer in the body because it's been turned into this. So it boggles my mind when I get these cases and the prosecutor talks tough. They say, well, we got carboxy-THC at 500 nanograms. So what? You've got 500 nanograms of something that is inactive that only tells me that what was active is no longer there anymore. And so you can go down the list of looking at papers and researchers all acknowledging that there's nothing to show any sort of association between presence of carboxy-THC, which they call THC-COOH, and recency of use or impaired psychomotor performance. NHTSA admits this. Again, right on their website. It is impossible to predict specific effects based on carboxy-THC concentrations. Different agencies all say the same thing. Society of Forensic Toxicologists says it must be emphasized that neither qualitative nor quantitative analysis of urine permits an evaluation of the effects of the drug or chemical on human behavior. Hell, the Department of Justice admits this. They say that a positive test, even when confirmed, does not indicate recency, frequency, or amount of use or impairment. Even the DOT in their DRE manual acknowledges this. They say there's two important metabolites of THC. One's carboxy-THC. Quote, there's no evidence at this time that this metabolite is psychoactive. So why are we even looking for it? It's literally just done to confuse. So the final issue then here, if carboxy-THC is useless, what about the blood test? And I know just last week, Governor Hickenlooper in Colorado signed into law House Bill 1325. I believe that takes effect on January 1st. And this is going to set a presumptive impairment limit for THC in the blood of drivers in the state of Colorado. The law says that THC in the blood at present of 5 nanograms or higher, quote, gives rise to permissive inference that the defendant was under the influence. Interesting, it says not under the influence of marijuana, it says under the influence of drugs. So I can't imagine, so many prosecutors are going to try to argue someone's under the influence of cocaine because they had 5 nanograms of THC in their body. I guess under the law they could technically try to do that. So will they be successful? Should we be worried, thinking that, oh no, there's now this presumptive standard, and the onus is going to be on the client to show why, in fact, he or she may have tested positive at 5 nanograms or higher, but in fact wasn't under the influence of marijuana. And again, I think that as a presumptive infirmant, the data isn't very strong, justifying that one can make this presumption based on the presence of THC in a single blood sample at a level of 5 nanograms or higher. And again, I like to look at NHTSA. I like to look at what the federal government says. This is what NHTSA has to say. They say, in terms of trying to infer impairment from a toxicological sample, it's arguably best that we use plasma. We're still not using plasma. We're using whole blood. Plasma is a more sensitive indicator. They suggest we use plasma, but they acknowledge that toxicologists have not come to any sort of consensus as to what these levels should be. And that's assuming they're using plasma, which, of course, they're not. Then we have Robey in 1993. This is, of course, from the Department of Justice study, or Department of Transportation study that was funded some years ago, and where they acknowledge, look, one of the reasons we took these drivers, dosed them, drove them on a closed course, drove them in heavy traffic, drove them in high-density urban traffic, and tested their blood levels, was to see if we could have predictive THC blood levels that we would associate with impairment. They talk about this right at the conclusion of the study. Drug plasma concentrations and driving performance. Quote, one of the program's objectives was to determine whether it is possible to predict driving impairment by plasma concentrations of THC and or its metabolite carboxy-THC in a single sample. The answer is very clear.
All right, so that's all we've got for today. Make sure you tune in next. Coming up next, we've got a replay of A Different View last night. We had quite a few technical difficulties, but it was a good show. Coming up tonight at 8 p.m. Pacific, we've got a Red Eyes Reggae flashback replay from show number 29, all 7 inches. And then tomorrow, we're live from Denver. So come on back here to 420radio.org in the Russ Belville Show, and we will see you next time. Take care of each other, Tokers.
This is the Russ Belville Show. The Russ Belville Show is blogging and podcasting daily at radicalruss.com.
You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it, and it goes down smooth.
Choices Inc. Now, here's a different view.